Hi, my name is Bjarne Sørensen, and I'll be the lecturer for Lead and Manage Organizational Change and/or contribute to organizational development. I really think that you'll enjoy this subject. It's very interesting. Now, in this subject, we'll talk about the changing world around us and how changes are influencing businesses and how they need to modify and adapt to changing environments. In this slide, you can see some of the factors that are changing around us. These are merely some of the factors. There are many more. Factors such as global warming, the rise of big data, robotics and artificial intelligence, funding cutbacks, changing legislation, a lot of businesses that are either downsizing or outsourcing, the shortening of product life cycles. For example, if you introduce an electronic products in the marketplace today, for example, a new mobile phone, it won't be around for all that long, and you need to come up with new products and new inventions. The rise of e-commerce, things like Amazon and eBay, are changing the way the retail in sector operates. Globalization and the many free trade agreements that Australia has entered, again, are factors that are forcing change upon us. Just over the last 2 years, we have generated more information and data than in the history of mankind. And while these flows of data has the potential to really benefit businesses, it is only businesses that really knows how to extract the value from this data that will benefit from the information that exists out there. We are in the middle of the information revolution, and a lot of businesses don't know how to use this information in an appropriate manner. Now try and imagine if you run a restaurant. Running a restaurant has for many years been fairly much the same. But in with the rise of social media, try and imagine a restaurant that does not engage in social media, that ignores what customers are saying about them online. You can probably imagine the consequences of ignoring such information and social media comments. If we look at the app industry, now the app industry only sort of emerged in I think it was 2008, and over recent years it has grown amazingly fast. Years ago, like 3 or so years ago, it overtook Hollywood in revenues, and this industry was only established 10 years ago. It's quite extraordinary how fast this industry has developed and overtaken an old and well-established industry like the Hollywood's film industry. Um, it, this is simply some interesting facts that shows just how fast the world is changing around us and why it's important for businesses to be aware of these changes and change with them. If we look at a bit further back in history and look at some of the changes that has sort of happened. This is a slide or information that I came across at the Marketing Week here in Adelaide. If we sort of look from back a bit over 100 years ago, from the year 1900 approximately to 1960, it was the age of manufacturers. The big corporations of the world, the ones that really made the money, were manufacturers. General Electric, General Motors, and Boeing were some of the big companies back then. Then it moved on to the age of distribution, sort of starting in the 1960s. And now it was companies like IKEA and Walmart and UPS that really made the money. Starting sort of in the 1990s, it was the age of information. It was companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon that really made a lot of money. since 2010, it's still the age of information, but it has also sort of become the age of consumers. And now companies like Facebook and Apple are the ones that are really cashing in. Now, just in this timeline here, it's really not that long, and you can see how quickly things can change. And businesses that sort of sticks their head in the sand and try and ignore the changes that are happening around us um, probably won't do all that well. We need to keep a keen eye on the external environment and the changes that are happening around us. Um, if we look at a company like Kodak, just in 1998, they had 170,000 employees, and they sold 85% of all photo paper worldwide. They sold a lot more things than photo paper. They sold cameras and many different things. But that business model very quickly disappeared with the rise of digital cameras. It's quite amazing, but Kodak actually invented the digital camera. They just didn't pursue the technology. Other companies did, and Kodak went into bankruptcy. Um, some of the other sort of interesting companies that have risen in recent years is Uber. It's really just a software tool. They don't own any cars, but they are now the biggest taxi company in the world. Airbnb is the biggest hotel company in the world, although they don't own any properties. So technologies are rapidly changing the world around us. If we look at the information revolution that we are in at the moment, if we look a bit, I guess, further back, if we look at the industrial revolution rather than the information revolution that we're in at the moment, but the industrial revolution of the 1800s, very few businesses actually survived. Before the industrial revolution, there was many tailors around. There was a lot of shoemakers around. There was a lot of millers around. There's a lot of blacksmiths around. But then came the industrial revolution, and most of these businesses simply got wiped out. A few of the smart ones embraced the Industrial Revolution and turned to mass production, and a lot of those prospered and grew, but many of the rest simply vanished and disappeared. When electricity came around, a lot of businesses ignored the benefits electricity had to offer. They didn't embrace that change, and many of them didn't stay around. 200 years later, we are now in the middle of the information revolution. And how many of today's businesses do you think will learn from history, will live to tell that tale? Um, it'll be interesting to see. We need to embrace change. It's very very important to do that in business. Now, um, I'll give you an example of how change can influence a business I used to run. I grew up in Denmark, and at some stage I moved to the United States to study. And while I lived in the United States, I was amazed by how cheap it was to make telephone calls. Um, Telephone calls were amazingly cheap in the United States compared to Denmark and compared to most other parts of the world. This was back in 1995, and back in 1995, most telecommunications industries in different countries were monopolized. There was a state-run or semi-state-run agencies or companies that would operate telephone services in most countries, including Denmark. When I moved to the United States, where there's a whole lot more free competition, the rates for international calls or domestic calls were much, much lower. And I was quite intrigued by just how cheap it was for me to call back to Denmark, living in the United States. So I did some research into the American industry, and I found a company called Tele Group in New York that that offered something that was called callback services to customers all over the world. The way it worked was that a customer in any country, say Australia or Denmark, could call up a number in New York, could call up a computer in New York. Now, that computer would not pick up the phone, so there wouldn't be any charge, but it will register who was calling and call them back. The person then in Australia or Denmark or any other country would pick up the phone and there will be a dial tone. Now they could call anywhere in the world at American prices through Tele Group in the United States. Now I contacted Tele Group and basically managed to strike a deal with them that I would move back to Denmark after I finished my studies in the United States, and I would recruit customers for them in the Danish market. And they would then give me, I think it was 7% of the revenues I could create. So I moved back to Denmark and I started to market the services in Denmark. And it went amazingly well. Customers could save up to 95% of their phone bills if they called through Tele Group. Um, I had to set up my own company because Tele Group didn't know a whole lot about me. They told me, yes, if you can find us customers, we'll give you 7% of the revenues, but you got to set up your own business and do it on your own behalf. So I set up a company in Denmark called Interbel. And through that company, I recruited customers. Um, I started out by trying to figure out who would be the most interested in Tele Group services. Customers could save the most money if they made international calls. You could save money going through the American company Tele Group if you called your neighbor in Denmark. But if you made international calls, the savings would be much, much higher. So I looked at the Danish society and quickly identified that immigrants in Denmark who wanted to call family in the home countries would be the most likely people to use the service. So I basically started targeting these communities for my promotional efforts, and it took off like a rocket. It was very easy to say sign customers up to Tele Group in the United States. Every time a customer would call me up to inquire about the services, I would send them 10 forms because they would give them to all their friends who would sign up as well. Um, Now, while this turned into a very good business, it only lasted a year or so. This was in '96, and the telecommunication industry in Denmark was changing, as it was around the world. And unfortunately for me, a lot of big corporations moved into the Danish marketplace. The monopoly that the Danish version of Telstra had had for a very long period of time uh, was taken away, and a lot of new, big, and much more professional companies went into the Danish marketplace. Um, After a year or so, I stopped recruiting new customers. I kept receiving revenues from the ones I had already gained until Tele Group in the United States went out of business in 1999. Now, this is just one example of how change can influence business. In this case, my business. I'm happy I established that business. It was a very good business, at least initially. But it just goes to show how changes can be forced upon businesses. Now, try and think about good proud old bookstores like Borders or Angus and Robinson versus Amazon, or think about Blockbuster versus Netflix. Um, these companies, Borders and Angus and Robinson and Blockbuster, was around for a very long time. What happened? Why didn't they change? Why didn't they create a company like Amazon? Or why didn't Blockbuster create a company like Netflix? They had the resources to do so, but they didn't. Now, this video was a short introduction into the topic of change management, and I really hope you'll enjoy this course. I suggest you now try and start your readings and think about what some of the changes are that are happening around the world and how it might influence the places where you are working or studying.